Our IA presentation is on Chartrand 1999 by Natalie, Codina, Anthony PIneda, Jeremy Wong, and Davion Davis.
In this presentation, we'll be talking about the background, design, procedure, results, ethics, culture and gender factors, importance, and other information about the Chartrand 1999 study.
The background of the study is where um, there were three experiments that were conducted in this study, and the one that we were focusing on is the first experiment, where um, where they tested motor behavior on participants, such as shaking their leg or touching their face, to see if um, the participants or slash strangers would follow the Confederates. And what the chameleon effect is, described by Chartrand and Barg, is it refers to a non-conscious mimicry of postures, mannerisms, facial expressions, and other behaviors of one's interaction with partners, such that one's behavior passively and unintentionally changes to match that of others in one's current social environment. So, which means that for example, if you shake your leg, next to a person, another person may shake their leg, um, just because you're shaking their leg. And the researchers were influenced by the monkey see, monkey do thing, where it was because of um, how monkeys and humans are good at imitation, such as you also need to um, do imitation to learn things in life. For example, that would be like dancing. You would try to imitate a teacher or someone who's trying to teach you dancing, or if you look at someone who's really good at dancing, you would try to imitate their moves to see um, if you can do it, and you learn from imitation. And this is under the social cultural of analysis because it relates to interactions with other groups of people, rather than biological and cognitive, um, because they don't really deal with um, social interaction with other people.
The design of the study consisted of multiple experiments. In this experiment that we focused more on the independent variables of the Confederates rubbing their face versus tapping their foot and smiling versus a neutral expression, which the Confederate was the one to prompt that effect. So the Confederate would be the one to first rub their face and then see if the participant would soon after follow. The dependent variables were the likelihood the participant would copy these behaviors, which, like I mentioned, would be the Confederate demonstrating these actions. The experiment gives you the option to allow for causation, uh, in the sense where if the participants are going to follow what the Confederates do, which is one of the strengths, which I failed to mention. Another strength would be the interaction between the participants and the Confederate forces to the participant to subconsciously pay attention to the Confederates' behavior. A weakness of the design would be having multiple experiments make the analysis more complex and tricky since there's more aspects to consider.
In experiment 1, there was a session 1 and 2. In these two sessions, there was a 10-minute interaction between the subject and the Confederate, where they took turns describing various photographs. The Confederate and subject interacted within session 1 was different from the interaction between the Confederate and subject in session 2. In session 1, Confederate either rubbed his face or shook his foot, never both. In session 2, Confederate 2 did whatever behavior Confederate 1 didn't do. The entire procedure was recorded and quarters later then judged whether participants mimicked the Confederates. The weaknesses of the procedure was that the procedure was videotaped without the consent of the subjects, which is a form of deception, and only discussed behavioral mimicking, not so much long-term mimicking and how that might affect the behavior of the subjects.
The results were able to show that participants smiled more with the smiling Confederate than with neutral Confederate. Another part of the results was that participants tapped their foot more with the foot tapping confederate than when the neutral confederate. The hypothesis is supported, the hypothesis being that one is more likely to subconsciously adapt their behaviors to match those around us. Coders are used to count the amount of times participants tap their foot or rub their face. The conclusions that were able to be pulled out from this results are that people are more likely to subconsciously engage in behaviors that match those around us. No known studies have called this conclusion into question.
The ethics of this experiment. Ethics are something important to consider, especially in psychology, because if a study isn't ethical, it can possibly make it less accurate. Also, it's important to consider the ethics because ethical experiments and studies upkeep the reputation of the psychology community. If there's a bad reputation, then people won't want to work with psychologists in the future, which would hinder research. So specifically relating to Chartrand 1999, what was done well? So there was no apparent physical or mental harm towards the participants. There was debriefing, so the participants were told afterwards what exactly went on in the experiment. Consent was asked for the videotapes to be coded and analyzed, and consent is something really important to consider. Anonymity was contained, so the participants' names weren't at all mentioned or jeopardized for the public. And what could have been improved? So they videotaped the participants initially without consent, meaning that they didn't ask the participants before doing so if they could be videotaped. There was deception within the procedure. Deception can be seen within the study on page 898, where Chartrand asserts, the experimenter re-entered the room and delivered the cover story. It was explained that the purpose of the study was to test a new projective measure by creating It was explained that the purpose of the study was to test a new projective measure being created by some psychologists in the department. This is untrue since Chartrand is trying to measure social behavior regarding the chameleon effect and how the behavior of others around us may subconsciously influence our own. So that was not at all true. There was also no mention of briefing, and there was no complete consent from the participants since Chartrand asserted themselves that this was part of a course requirement at New York University. Culture and gender factors are something important to assess when looking at a study because the culture and gender can greatly impact the ecological validity and how much this experiment is representative of humanity as a whole. So both males and females were being tested within the study. As on page 897, Chartrand asserts that 39 male and female students enrolled in an introductory psychology course at New York University participated. So, as aforementioned, the subjects were New York University introductory psychology course students. This is something known as a convenient sampling. A convenient sampling is something that is cheaper, quicker, and convenient, as the name may suggest. Now, it is not at all representative, but it is a practical option since it is something cheaper and quicker to do. However, it must be noted that the ecological validity of convenient samplings are low since they're not attempting to represent society as a whole and people's culture as a whole. Now, Chartrand also says that this was a partial fulfillment of a course requirement, which implies that the participants had to participate in this, which isn't quite consent. If it's part of a course requirement, that implies that the students are pretty much being forced to participate as part of their course. And now, while it's good that this experiment tested both males and females, something that they left out and something that should be considered is whether the Confederates were assigned to the subjects randomly despite sex. So that means that male Confederates could have been paired with female subjects and vice versa just by random, or if they purposely paired the same sex together. So female Confederates were only paired with female subjects, and same for males. The reason this is important is because it could possibly change the results, since gender and sex is part of one's identity. And if we are with people who are the same sex or different sex from our own, it could change our behavior towards them and change the likelihood that we will mimic their own behavior as well, which is what we are measuring here.
So what was important about the study was that it helps us further understand the chameleon effect as a theory, because through the first experiment, we were able to find out that participants were able to um, follow what follow the Confederates on what they did, such as through their sort of motor skills or motor techniques, where they were fidgeting their foot or touching their face. And Chartrand versus the past chameleon effect studies, what he compares is that all the past studies, all of them have been observational, which means they kind of show no correlation, versus Chartrand and the ones that he has done. There's no control groups in the past experiments, such as no testing on minimal conditions where behavioral matching occurs, or where people did not interact with each other or incorporate variability within subject partners, such as Chartrand, where he sort of makes this. This is Chartrand studies are more based on like the social cultural, because it is more group based for his studies rather than what all the other past studies have been. And this shows like humans tend to imitate the behavior of others, which is a strategy of social interactions. And it shows that one of the principles that humans are social beings, or they're like they have a need to belong, like social animals.